Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at onpurposely.com.
Wonderful news. Letters from Home has recently joined the Krista family in Seattle, Washington, and we are now part of the Purposely Podcast Network and channel. Thank you for celebrating with me, all of you current listeners, and a special welcome to all of you new listeners. To give you a great sample of the stories you can expect or may not have had a chance to hear yet, we are doing a From the Vault series of some everyday extraordinary faith stories from the past. Here is Holland Webb's story, titled Adopting Two Boys, ages 3 and 4, while single in his 20s.
And the stories that we often tell around adoption are stories of hope. They're stories of love. They're stories of wholeness. And that's great, but that's incomplete. They're also stories that begin in brokenness. No matter how well you phrase it, no matter how well-intentioned you are, no matter if you can do all the right things. And the fact is, this person still lost their parents.
And now for the next episode of Letters from Home, sending encouragement to your doorstep by capturing the heartbeat of God's people, one story at a time.
Hi, it's Meg Gleesner, your host. Today's guest had a childhood that left him with a gaping hole, and so began a mission to redeem what he lost. But not just for himself, he wanted to redeem that for someone else. His journey spans many countries and cultures and includes adopting two little boys as a young single man in his 20s. Who does that? And he touches on so many great topics like how Americans are perceived abroad, working for nonprofits, biracial adoption, ghostwriting, having a parent with dementia. You will hear his love for books and leave with some great quotes and recommendations. Here is the redemption faith story of the witty and everyday extraordinary Holland Webb. Holland, I am so grateful to have you on this show today. Just meeting you and the short time we did at that podcasting conference in February, and who knew the world was going to be turned upside down. But I have to say, you were one of the highlights for me when we had that dinner where we just happened to sit and visit, and I got to hear your heart and your story. I still remember parts of it, and now I've read your book, and you're such a blessing. So thanks for being on today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Meg.
Well, let's get right into your story. One of the things that I remember about your story was what you were sharing about your upbringing and with your parents.
Sure. Well, my parents married. My mother was 30. My father was 64. So there was already a big age gap there. And my mother told me later that they didn't want to have any children, him because he was so much older than she, and she because she's just not that kind of person. In fact, after she got pregnant with me unexpectedly, the man that she worked with, she was a social worker, and the man she worked with said, "You know that child is not going to survive 6 months. There's not a maternal bone in your body." And he told me that actually sometime later. He's the one who said, "I didn't think you'd survive. We took bets in our office how long this baby was going to live in her care." But I did live.
You lived.
Right. But she didn't inadvertently do anything to end my life there too early. But I think it just sort of came along. You know, they didn't expect to have children. They didn't want to have children. They were planning not to have children. And lo and behold, I showed up. And about a year after I was born, my father passed away. So then it became just me and my mother. And that was a real turning point for her. She had been a Christian because people in Southern Appalachian small Appalachian communities were Christians, right? You went to the Methodist Church or the Church of Christ or the Baptist Church. And if you didn't, then you ought to. Right. So her family went to the Methodist Church, and she was interested in that and committed to that. And it had been meaningful, but it had not been meaningful as it was when she was faced with having a baby she didn't know how to take care of. And her much, much older husband had suddenly passed away. And I can't imagine, I can imagine what made him want to marry her. I can't really imagine what made her want to marry someone so much older. And I think for her, it had to be almost the loss of like a husband and a father at the same time. But at that time for her, it was a real turning point, and it was into a deeper form of faith. and she would find the hymns that she had grown up with, and go through those, and she would find scriptures that she had learned in the church and go through those, and it became a more meaningful thing for her. So when I grew up in a deeply Christian environment, because she plunged right in, to the whole community of faith that she found so welcoming and so nurturing and energizing around that time. So when you talk about growing up born again, I think there was a book, Growing Up Born Again, some years ago. When I grew up born again, I mean, we went to church all the time, and I went to a Christian school, and I read Christian books, and it was a very religious sort of childhood, not a bad childhood at all. I know there are a lot of folks who look back at that time of their lives who had similar sort of upbringings, and they have all this negativity that they want to shower on that. Well, you can certainly point out some of the faults and failures, and I'd be more than happy to give an internal critique. But there are many people who grow up much, much worse situations and much worse environments than that. It has its shortcomings, but boy, it sure has its benefits too.
For sure. I'm curious, where was your dad as far as the faith picture, and how did the church receive the age difference? I don't know if I told you, but my stepdad is actually 4 or 5 years younger than I am.
Mhm.
And my mom passed away last year, and she was 73. And, that adds a
Sure.
total dimension when you try and bring your wife to church, and she's older than, you're
Right.
How was that welcomed in your mom's, and how'd that affect her faith?
I don't know. And first I would say he was Church of Christ. And I think the kind of church that he went to was more focused on knowing the Bible and doing right than it was on having a transformative experience with the Holy Spirit. So it was a little bit of a different understanding of what it meant to be a Christian. But I don't know if they even went to church together. She may have gone to one and he to another, or they may have just gone very rarely to the same congregation. I don't think it was for them a spiritual connection as much as it was a formation of a relationship around other things. The community, I don't think was as receptive, but at large. But if my mother could do something to be, she's contrarian sort of person. I mean, whatever is the prevailing idea, she takes the opposite idea. Whatever is, she's sort of formed in opposition to whatever is going on. That's in a way how she's always understood her role, is to break away from whatever's going on. And if prevailing cultural ideas around her shift to the way that she's been going, she'll turn around and come back the opposite way. She's not as much committed to the idea as she is committed to the idea of being in opposition to the what's going on around her. So I don't think she cared. I think the community probably did it. Now people have such diverse family structures, but as you were pointing out, I've known somebody else who had that same experience where their stepdad was like about their age. And that is one thing we still haven't seemed to accept culturally is women who are much older than their husbands. And I'm not quite sure why that is. We still seem to have a pushback against that.
I actually have an episode where I did a tribute to my mom, and he shares their love story at the end, and it's pretty beautiful. But they had a counseling session when they were engaged, and they told my mom, "Are you ready?" And it was her fourth marriage, but "Are you ready to go through puberty again?" And they told him, "Are you ready to be a caregiver?" And he said, and I said, yes, and I meant it. And at the end, she was saying, when she was really sick, "This isn't what you signed up for." And he said, "No, this is what I signed up for."
Oh, wow.
It's kind of a beautiful love story. And yes, it is not the usual thing for sure. And I'm sure your mom, being that kind of contrarian, I'm sure that was a fun roller coaster or ride for you as a young boy. Were you an only child?
I was, yes. They weren't married long enough to have more than me. So I was an only child. My mother had, for most of my childhood, she had the same best friend who also had an only child. So Amanda and I sort of claim one another, but at the same time, we don't have to claim one another. So,
How did your mom adjust after losing your dad?
I don't think she did, honestly. I think when I was about 7, we moved away from the small town that she had grown up in and that he had spent virtually all of his life in. And we moved to a mid-sized city in the Midwest, Springfield, Missouri. That was a big change for me. Meg, the funny thing that I think about now is this would have been like 1984. And of course, I'd come from this really small town. And when you took pictures, you remember the cameras and there was film in the camera and you had to take all the pictures on the roll before you could take the roll out of
Yes.
the camera, even if all you wanted was one or two pictures. Then you had to take and have it developed. Okay, well, in this town that I was born in, you took your film to the drugstore. And the lady there put it in a little package and sealed it up and sent it off. And you waited, I don't know, 10 days, 2 weeks, something like that, before you got your pictures back. And then you showed up at the drugstore and picked them up. Well, when we first moved to Springfield, there was a little kiosk in the parking lot of a shopping center. It was a Kodak kiosk, and it said 24-hour photo. And I thought, that's impossible. I was 7, right? So I just learned, I knew 24 hours was a day. And I thought, that's
Mind blown.
absolutely impossible. And I said something to my mother about it finally. And she said, well, at the mall on the other end of town, there's a 1-hour photo. And I thought she was just making that up. There was no way pictures could be developed in an hour. It took 2 weeks. But to me, that's just kind of symbolic or illustrative of what a change that was for me and what a growth experience it was for me. But I think it was for her too, because it allowed her to kind of leave behind the life that she'd had and open up a new one. And that kind of became a habit. But she was able to open up a new life for herself, and therefore she was able to open up a new life for me. And I'm not saying the place we were from was a bad place. It was just a place that was too much of what had always been, and it didn't allow her to open up and have a new life. So she went somewhere else and developed that. When I was about 11, she became a missionary. We went first to the UK for several months she participated in a training program. We lived in London. That was a real experience. So really, when I was 7, I was living in a town where you took 2 weeks to get your pictures developed. And when I was 11, I was living in London, which, is one of the largest cities in the world. But that was a real mind-blowing kind of experience. I remember meeting people from all over the world. People were coming and, I'm from Mozambique, and I'm like, where's that? And India and of course people from around Europe and the UK. But that was a fun time. It was another sort of growing experience for me and a challenging spiritual experience, because up to that point, most of the Christians that I knew were very much alike. And then I started meeting people from other countries and who worshiped differently and who thought differently and whose backgrounds were different from mine and who had no idea what these American cultural icons of Christianity were, and who had their own cultural, understandings of what it meant to be a Christian. That was expanding. And then we went from the UK, we went to the Philippines and stayed there 4 years. Manila is at least as large as London, and having that big experience was still there. But of course, Manila is characterized much more by poverty. And we lived in what I guess you would call a working class Filipino neighborhood at that time, right outside our window. We lived at the top of the hill, and there was an artesian well that had been, you could pump it. And that was where the men in the community took showers. And then at the bottom that was where the women took showers, but there was more of a wall. You could sort of see back in there a little bit, but not really. But the men didn't care that much. So they would just strip down to shorts or underwear and take a shower right there outside our window. And that was a chance for me to see for real over time what it meant to not be an American, to be something else. Many people who are my age we were kind of the beginning of people taking mission trips and things like that. And there's a lot of good that came of that. But in 1 or 2 weeks, you can't get the experience that you get over time. Macaulay Perkins, who's a novelist, says, if you're going to write a story set in another country, you better stay there long enough to hold some babies. You better figure out what that culture is like, and it takes time to do that. For me, taking class at the school that I went to was an international school, but we had classes in Filipino history. We had classes in Tagalog, the language in Manila. And those things began to give me a picture of what it meant not to be an American, what it meant when your history is characterized by someone else coming in and dominating you for 550 years instead of you being the dominant power. What it means that your language and your culture is subordinate to other people's, and your country is thought of as the maids and the houseboys and the drivers and the janitors for the wealthy people of the world, because that's what Filipinos are known for doing, as opposed to how Americans are perceived internationally.
What was the impression that you got about Americans while being schooled there? What did you step back and see? What moment did you have?
There was an old man who lived across the street from us, and he had grown up way out in the mountains somewhere. I don't remember where he was from, but he absolutely loved Americans because during World War II, when he was a young teen, people were starving to death. The Japanese Imperial Army absolutely was the history of their occupation of the Philippines during World War II is a lesson in savagery that would rival anything Hitler did in Europe. It's just that we are more interested in Europe because they're like us than we are in seeing what the Japanese Imperial Army did in Asia, and particularly in the Philippines. But people were just starving in the barrios. And when the Americans began to make headway back into the Philippines and began to reconquer, the Philippines was an American colony prior to the Japanese occupation. When we began making that back in, he said this man told us the American planes would fly over and they would drop bags of rice into the barrios. And he said, that's how we survived. And I will always be grateful to your country for that. But younger people in the late 80s and early 90s in the Philippines had a different perspective. They saw us as a colonial power, which we were for 50 years, and then as being a sort of meddlesome big brother for the next 50. Post-World War II, we technically left the Philippines, but we never really left them alone. We had 2 large military bases there, and somehow we were always involved in what was going on. And there was among the students of the time, there was a real pushback against that. We don't want you here anymore. Get out and let us run our own country for a while, which happened about the end of the time that we were there. The U.S. pulled out of both Clark and Subic bases and pulled out a lot of Filipino domestic politics and sort of let them figure it out. But hearing those 2 generations speak so differently of the same country was interesting. And I think it offers you an opportunity to see how you wish they could have talked to one another about this, right? They would have understood better why the older people felt the way they did. And the older people might have understood a little better why those students felt the way that they did. How Americans are perceived in the Philippines now, I don't really know. I still talk to several people there. I still have a little bit of business work with some guys there, but I've never asked. I've never inquired what they think, because I'm not sure if I'll get a true answer or if I'll get the answer that, the person thinks I want to hear.
Where you were there, is that where your personal faith journey began?
I think my personal faith journey sort of always was there. I know no one is born a Christian, but in some ways it feels like I was, because it was so much a part of who we were. But it certainly matured in some ways. But I think coming back from the Philippines for me was maybe more of a maturative experience. You're forcing me to reflect on things, Meg. Why aren't you doing this? Why don't you have a podcast about, something that's less personal? Anyway, coming back sort of forced me into, when you have to reintegrate into your own culture and you leave that place. I think for anyone who lives abroad, you're part of, but never really part of. You're able to retain a certain separateness and a certain feeling of being a little bit special. And then you come back and you discover that you're actually not special. You're just one of another 250 million people who live here.
How old were you when you came back, or how?
I was 16 when we came back. This was 93. Yeah, this was 93, so 16.
You finished out high school in the States.
And I took the GED in the States. Does that count?
Hey, that counts in my book. I think a lot of people are going to be doing that. I'm surprised how many of my Christian mom friends are not having a plan for school and what they're going to do. And
Wow.
I have a feeling there will be a whole generation, as well as they're not counting the SAT anymore and that sort of a thing. So clearly GED or whatever education doesn't reflect intelligence, right? Sometimes it just reflects opportunity or discipline.
Yeah.
But so you got your GED, yippee.
I did. And it counted for everything. It's never been a problem. But I got a Christian ministry major, and it was my intention to go into that, right? I thought, I grew up in that. Everybody I knew was in some kind of Christian ministry. Everybody was a pastor or a missionary or a Christian school teacher or a teacher at a Christian college or something like that. Or they spent a lot of time devoting their volunteer life to that. And that's how I knew them. I didn't know them as a teacher, a truck driver, or a lawyer. I knew them as a women's ministries director or a Sunday school teacher or a church board member. So I expected to just go into that in some way. And, I graduated from college at 21 with this degree in Christian ministry. And there aren't a whole lot of 21-year-olds who have a whole lot to offer in Christian ministry. I did not. Now, some do, especially if you're good with kids or you're good with music or whatever, but I can't sing. I didn't like children. Just, no.
You weren't leading, parenting workshops or couples retreats or anything.
No, definitely not. So my solution to this was, well, I'll go to graduate school, right? Because if you're good at school, the unfortunate thing I have discovered and is I was good enough at school that I felt like, well, I'll just keep doing this because I'm being rewarded for it, right? So got a master's in international public policy, thinking, well, I can help sort of advance the kingdom of God through in the life of politics and international relations, and thought I would work for the State Department. That didn't quite work out, but I ended up in a Christian international development organization where I worked for several years, and that sort of married those two degrees and gave me a sense of purpose and value. And it was while I was there that I adopted Jeffrey and John Paul.
I definitely am excited about really getting into that. Were you disheartened at all working in the in that Christian realm? I know my daughter, our oldest daughter, really had a heart for working with homeless, and she served in a church all through college that just reached homeless people and that sort of thing. But then she started doing internships for nonprofits, and she was just horribly disappointed about how much of what they did was what they were actually doing to reach people was a real small level, but they're tooting their own horns about the few things that were happening, and the fundraising felt like the heart of it. And I just wondered what your experience was with that.
Wow, I could answer that on so many different levels. My personal experience was pretty good in that our organization was set up in a way that we really did help other people succeed. The issues that we addressed were real issues. It was an international disability and development organization, so we provided things like cataract surgeries, prosthetics,
Great.
Microeconomic loans to people with disabilities in low and middle income countries.
I definitely want to link that. Maybe we can link that in the show notes. So if people want to help out with that, that sounds like an actual amazing ministry.
Well, I think it was a very real issue. It was an issue not everybody's discussing. It's not a sexy issue, but people with disabilities, if they're grouped together, would be the world's largest minority. And disability is an increasing issue in developing countries because we've done a pretty good job with maternal child health, which means that a lot of children who would have died and a lot of mothers who would have died in the 70s and 80s and 90s are living, but they are not thriving. And so we're seeing an increase in disability on the front end. We're also seeing it on the back end because we're doing a better job of providing nutrition for people. And so they're living longer, right? And older people get disabilities, right? They get cataracts, they fall, they, have other things that come up that are disabling conditions for them, deafness. And as people live longer, we see more and more of that on the back end of life as well. So it's a really important issue. It's not a sexy issue. It gets overlooked a lot. And we were doing very practical things to address it. So in terms of the mission, I think we did really well. And we did well in that did we waste money? Yes, but not intentionally. I think what for me became an issue was that, you can work in ministry and you can work in service to other people and you can start to develop ideas about yourself, right? I'm a great person because I do all these things to help other people. I'm probably a lot more moral than our donors because they just give money, but I'm here all the time and I know things they don't know. I use the right language about disability and development that other people don't use. And you kind of can develop a sense that you are morally superior to other people because of what you do. And I think it's something that pastors face. I think it's something that a lot of people who spend their lives helping others can reward themselves with this feeling of, of moral superiority, of a sense of spiritual elevation, and not really think about the fact that, yes, I may be here all the time, but I'm paid to help people and our donors are paying to help people, right? They may not know the right language to use about disability, but they just sent us a nice check that they could have used for themselves. They are giving, and I'm helping, but I'm being paid to do it. And it's hard to keep that in mind. Right. I think too, people, will say to you, "Oh, isn't it wonderful that you do this work? Oh, you must have such a great heart," until you believe it. You know, you believe what other people tell you.
Pride is so insidious and such a
It is.
slayer in the church. And I think it's just one of those gross sins that we can get so comfortable with, we don't even notice. So it's encouraging to me that being in that field, you were aware that, whoa, hold the phone here.
Yeah.
So I know that you're a parent because you told me about that when we were visiting, and I have your book, Adventures in Fatherhood, which is an incredible book, and I would love to dive into how that came to be.
Sure. Well, I always wanted to adopt children. I don't particularly know why. I mean, I didn't sit down and have a reason behind that, but I knew that because I grew up without a father, right? My father died when I was a year old, and my mother never so much as went on a date with anyone after that. So as a young child, I just assumed that there would be a point that would come that I wouldn't miss that, or that I wouldn't wish that hadn't happened. You know, I figured I became an adult, right? You suddenly get handed all these wonderful tools with which to handle life, and you're magical. You know how to do stuff. Then I became an adult, and I don't know. I missed whenever those things were being handed out, whenever that toolbox for life was getting handed out. I missed that. I began to realize more and more what you miss when you miss half your parents, right? However you lose that person, you miss a great deal. And I think in one of his books, I think it's called Father Fiction, Donald Miller talks about growing up without a father. And he says, he uses this metaphor. He says when he would go to the library, and the librarian would open up a book about a dragon, and she would read the story, and he would look at the pictures of the dragon carrying the boy on his back, and he would think, wouldn't it be fantastic to own a dragon and be able to run your hands along its scaly back and fly on it wherever you wanted to go? And he said, I could imagine owning a dragon easier than I could imagine what life was like with a father. And I think that's what my experience was as well as a younger kid. But the more you age into adult life, the more you realize, no, I was missing something. And what I was missing has affected me, and it's affected me negatively. And it's meant that I'm missing whole pieces of what I should have to function as an adult. So I wanted to be able to give that to someone else. And I said something about wanting to adopt children, and that got me started.
Were you married?
Was I married? No, I wasn't married. I've never been married. But if you have single women in your listening audience.
Yes. He's a great guy. And he's handsome too. You can't see that.
You can contact me on Twitter.
We'll be giving out his information later.
No, I wasn't married. I just sort of plunged in and tried this. And, I guess I was too young and too naive to know that I really did not know what I was doing. I mean, I'd never even seen anyone do this, right? I just did it.
I was a mom I became pregnant at 22. So hashtag same here, Holland. No manuals. 3 years later, I had 3 kids, 2 and under. So I think we're all pretty ill-equipped. I mean, my kids are just graduating from college at 22, and wow, I was a mom already. So yeah, totally ill-equipped. And you were a single man in your late 20s when you adopted the boys?
I was. And they were 3 and 4. I think I was 27.
What was the whole process for adoption, especially being a single man? That must have been a few more hoops to jump through, as well as, hey, there's no options. You're the sole provider for these fellas.
Well, international adoption, which is what I looked at first, because I'd lived abroad, I'd traveled abroad, I'd studied international relations, I worked for an international development organization. I thought that would be the way to go. And it wasn't. Hardly any countries will allow single men to adopt. A few more will allow single women. And then, of course, over time, there have become all kinds of issues raised around international adoption, by the way, and it's fallen out of favor, and it's fallen out of not very
Hmm.
many people are doing it anymore. In fact, I think it was a year or two ago that one of the largest Christian organizations that places children actually stopped all their international adoptions because they said for the same price that they can bring one child from Kenya to the US for an adoption, they can place 50 children in Kenya with Kenyan families, and that this was not a good use of
Oh, wow.
resources. So, I mean, if anybody has adopted internationally, I'm not criticizing that approach. I'm just saying it's an approach that was overly complex, and so it's kind of declined because it's too hard to do. It's too expensive and too complicated. So I started looking at domestic adoption, which all I'd ever really heard of was people adopting babies. And what do you hear but all these terrible stories, right, of people who spend years and years trying to adopt, or people who try an open adoption and the birth mother changes her mind at the last minute, or someone comes back 5 years later and there's been some snafu in the legal issues, and they lose their child. Virtually none of these stories ever actually happen in real life. I mean, a few of them may, but most of them don't. They're just scare stories. But that was all I had heard. And a lady at our church was working in adoptions. She had adopted 2 biracial children herself, and she went from that into helping place Black and biracial infants with families, because children of color are harder to place in adopted families, or at least they were at the time. And so I watched what she was doing, and I thought, well, I bet I could do that, but I wouldn't be picked by a birth mother, because if a birth mother has a choice, she's going to pick 2 parents. So then that led me to foster care, to the Department of Social Services. And I applied, and I'm sure it raised a few eyebrows, but when you're working with the state, they can't discriminate against you on the basis of anything, apparently. And whenever they called me about, I don't know, it was a long process, but it wasn't a difficult process. It was just a long process. Whenever they called me about Jeffrey and John Paul, I said, are there no married couples that are willing to take these 2 little boys? They're 3 and 4, and you didn't name off anything that was wrong with them other than that they're 3 and 4. There's no condition that would make them hard to place. And the social worker said there are no married couples willing to accept 2 Black boys. We've had some married couples who would said they would take 1, but not who would take 2. And it's you or if you say no, our next choice is a single mom. I said, okay. Well, if it's a single mom or a single dad, it's a horse apiece, right? I'll do this. And my mother had said she would help until I got married. So she helped till they were grown, because that's what happened. But yeah, they showed up at my house, and I was a little surprised. I didn't know very much about children.
Ta-da! Baptism
Right.
into parenting.
Yeah, this one's 4 and this one's 3. Here you go. Bye.
And the good thing is they don't really know that you don't know.
That's right. You can pull the wool over their eyes for a long time, can't you? I think they know now. I think they've got a clue now. They're 20 and 19 now, I should add, if anyone's thinking that this happened like yesterday. No, they're 20 and 19. So this was 16, a little over 16 years ago. And I know a lot's changed in adoption since then, and there are lots of people now. It's not that uncommon, at least around here, to see transracial families. You don't see very many African-American adults with white children, but you do see a fair number of white adults with African-American and biracial children. And, I know that there are also, as I said, there's sticky issues that surround international adoption. There are sticky issues that surround transracial adoption as well. But anytime you start engaging in adoption, you are engaging in a second best, right? The best would be if everybody who had kids could stay married and raise them, but they don't, and they can't. So anytime you are participating in brokenness, anytime you participate in adoption, no matter what your role is, you're participating in a broken system and in a broken and fractured relationship. And I think the stories that we tell about adoption, I'm very interested, in how the way we tell stories affects our perception of issues, and how the words that we use affect our perception of issues. And because I think our language and our stories shape what we believe to be true more than the facts do. And the stories that we often tell around adoption are stories of hope. They're stories of love. They're stories of wholeness. And that's great, but that's incomplete. They're also stories of that begin in brokenness. And there's no way that, there's, no matter how well you phrase it, no matter how well-intentioned you are, no matter if you can do all the right things. And the fact is, this person still lost their parents. However they lost them, through whatever the circumstances were, it still happened. Somebody still lost their children. That still happened. Whatever, even if that was entirely their choice from the beginning and that was what they wanted to do, it still happened to them. And it still had to be a very difficult and choice that shapes your life from then on.
How did you make it through those early years with the boys, and what did you learn?
Oh, I learned that I could bite my tongue. Everything that came into my mind did not have to come out of my mouth. I was pretty easy as children go. I think, if my mother wanted me to do something, I did 85% of it. I didn't cause trouble. I mean, I had my own issues, but they mostly affected me. They didn't affect the people around me. And so adults tended to think that I was well behaved, and I got a lot of accolades for that as a child. I didn't get that. Jeffrey and John Paul, they have other struggles. Being, overly well behaved as children isn't one of them. And I really did not understand that many people experience a lot of, many people push back very hard against the world. And that's just part of growing up for them. And to me, they would do something or say something. I would just be horror stricken, not realizing that maybe that was normal. I mean, it was hard for me to judge what was normal behavior for them in their situation, and then what was really out there and needed to be, I needed to be concerned about. And I think that some things happened that I probably were signals that something needed to be addressed, and I just missed them. And other things that I was really concerned about addressing that probably were just normal behavior for kids, because I just didn't know.
Did your church come alongside at all, or did you have any kind of a community that helped fill in some of the gaps that you felt like you were lacking?
The church that I went to at the time was very invested in adoption, and our children's pastor was particularly interested in helping kids who were adopted or who's like, because we had so many in the church. So she was a really big help. Pastor Brenda was a really, really big help in making sure that there were a lot of other people to do something, say something, be around for the boys when they were younger. And I really will always appreciate her for that, because she understood and saw. Now, when they were, I think, 8 and 9, we moved to Guatemala and spent 3 years in Guatemala.
Oh,
Yeah. So, and there we had a great community as well, because I taught in a school.
did your mom go with?
She did,
Yeah.
because we had her, and then we had the other teachers at the school who were a big help, and the parents of the kids.
Great.
The kids were all, well, except Jeffrey and John Paul and 5 or 10 others. The rest of the school was Guatemalan, but the other parents and, other kids and older, everybody just sort of filled in and was supportive and present. So yes, the church, and then later that particular school were great help. I was going to say, a few years ago, I'm not sure when, my mother began to live with dementia, because it's such an insidious thing. We're talking about how pride is insidious. So is dementia. Somebody asked me a few months ago, how long has your mother had dementia? And I said, well, there's been something wrong with her mind for about 75 years. But how long there's been, it's been something you can identify, I don't really know. But for a little over a year, she's been completely disabled by it. She had a particular incident, and because of the kind of dementia that she has, which tends to move in steps rather than gradually, she had a particular incident last summer that divorced her from reality. So in the last year, my oldest son has been in Alaska as part of the U.S. Army, and my younger son and I and our 2 dogs have been here taking care of my mother. The dogs are a big help. One of the dogs has Lou Gehrig, so he's not a help at all. He has to be carried most places now, but the other one will at least be as helpful as a dog can. But we do that, and that was not something I ever expected to do, believe me, or ever wanted to do, or really knew anything about. But you learn, right?
Yeah, look, you've had a long journey with your mama.
Yeah, indeed. But the counseling is helping.
I feel like every stage of life, your parents, or lack thereof, or lack of how, if they are alive, so much is a part of who we are and how we process life through every decade.
So you're like loving them and furious at them at the same time?
Yes. Disappointed and still holding out hope that they might be something different. But then their health gets to a point where you realize, you know what, that's it. It is what it is. And I'm going to either decide I'm going to love them for who they are, mentally, physically, whatever before dementia, your mom, at some point you had to realize, she is who she is, and this is the mom I have, and I'm just going to enjoy what's there and be thankful. And then health starts declining. That adds a whole extra element of love, right?
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, because there are times I think, there's just this other few things I really wish I could have thrown at you, not objects, but, disappointments or
Holland,
frustrations or things that I really, and to realize, okay, you're done. You're done. That's over. Whatever you wish had been different, it's over. You can't deal with that. You just have to address what's there and do the best you can with what you got, and hope that when I am an old person, Jeffrey and John Paul will feel the same way. And whatever frustrations and disappointments we have with you, you will just have to let them go and keep you around anyway.
And it's a journey. And I know we'll get into, when we get to our PS, a little more about your sons, but is there a verse that's meant a lot to you in your life that you really hold on to?
When I was in college and I was angst-ridden about what I was going to do in life, because, I thought that I was going to be somehow what I was going to do was going to be so significant that I had to really be worried about it. I don't know if other people feel that way or not, but that's how I felt. Like, I thought I was so significant that I needed to worry about what I was going to do. But when I was praying about that, I found a verse of scripture, Proverbs 31, 8 and 9. And anytime you bring up Proverbs 31, people think of the Proverbs 31 woman, a wife of noble character who can find. And then the author goes into all these wonderful things that the woman he's married to does. She's a business person. She's runs her house. She takes care of her children and her servants, and everybody arises and calls her blessed. But before that, you have the sayings that King Lemuel's mother taught him, which is the first 9 verses of Proverbs 31. The last 2 are: speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute, speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and needy. And I think that could maybe. There are people who say, we don't speak up for others, we speak up with others. But I think that's just a more nuanced understanding of what King Lemuel's mother was saying to him in those 2 verses. You are a person of relative power. You're a person of relative privilege. You're a person of relative wealth. Use that to benefit people who face a wall, who face a ceiling, who can't advocate for themselves, who can't do for themselves what you can do, and give them that voice, give them that hand, give them whatever it is that you can lend them to help them step across that, to help them break down that barrier, so that they have access to God and access to the kingdom of God and access to the life of the kingdom of God with nothing standing in the way.
Amen. Well said. Before we seal up the envelope on this letter of encouragement, we have prepared a little treat for you that we like to call the PS, so you can see more of the heart and personality of our guest.
Here is your PS.
Are you ready for some bonus questions?
I suppose so.
I have to start with one question. One of the most remarkable things about you when I met you was a really beautiful pair of yellow shoes. Do we still have those?
Yes, but I can't wear them anymore. They got messed up.
Oh no, the dogs?
Dogs.
At least you have the shoes, or did you? Maybe we can turn them into a quilt. I don't know. Just thinking.
I've never made a quilt in my life.
You said that you wanted to there was a strong desire in your heart to see what was lacking and to be able to provide that for someone else. Do you feel that you've given that to your boys and really to your mother as well?
Do I feel that I've given that to my boys? Yes and no. I was probably better than nothing. I don't know that I was good, but I was better than nothing. And I wish that I knew then what I know now, because I would have given them so much more. I would have understood children in their particular situation a lot better. So, if I adopt any more children, I'll be 70 years old when they're grown. But if I did, I would know a little more about what I was doing.
What do you wish you would have known that you think would have helped you so much? Because, there's people out here who are like, hey, tell me, I want to know. I need help.
Well, I would come up with 2 things really quick. Number 1, I wish I would have known my own shortcomings better, so I could have addressed them quicker. If I'd understood what was wrong with me and fixed me, it would have helped them. But I was too quick to want to go fix them first and leave me, unaddressed. But in fact, fixing me would have helped them. It's the old put your mask on first.
Right. And I think what can happen is parenting happens so fast. I think a lot of times it's not even
Right.
a conscious choice to say, I'm not taking care of myself, but it's something I've realized over time too. You're focusing, you're responsible for all these people, for them not hurting themselves, for them having some character, for, teaching them about the Lord. And so your mind and your heart's focused on all this, and you don't realize sometimes that, oh, I need to look at myself
Right.
more. And I agree. It's something that I'm still learning as a grandma. I'm still learning these things.
Oh, wow. The other thing I would do, I think, differently is I would realize that I think I said this before, but just whatever comes in my head doesn't have to roll off my tongue. You say things to kids that you would never say to adults just because you can and they can't respond back to you. I don't know if anyone else has done that, but I have. I would watch what I said much more closely. I started to do that after a while. After a while, I realized the things that I'm saying are having a lot greater impact than I intend for them to. And I have control over my mouth. Boys were in their early teens, which is a great time to just, spit out a response because they say stuff, right? And then your natural inclination is I'm going to say it back. But that was when I began to realize that if 1 Corinthians 13, which describes what love is patient, love is kind, and it's not rude or self-seeking and doesn't insist on its own way, and it hopes all things and believes all things and bears all things, then it can bear hearing something and not offering a sarcastic response right that minute. If it keeps no record of wrongs, then it's not going to bring up something from the past, when no matter how much you want to, no matter how much you feel that this would fix this situation, it's not going to. It's just going to make it worse. All it will do is make you feel better right that minute.
For me too, that's just one of those things to wrap your head around, giving each of your kids a fresh start every day. The Lord said that we forgive 490 times a day. And that is so true with children. You've got maybe the button pusher or the kid who's always spilling and breaking everything, and you just want to cry or yell. And I was a mentor mom for a few years, and I asked at the table, who here struggles with yelling? And everybody raised their hand. It's something we struggle with, and you can't take those words back. And when you start to see as they get older, and I don't know what it was for me, but there's a certain weird piece in your mind that they're not a person when they're little. And that sounds like an awful thing to say, but I think there was something, they're little kids. But when you start to see it on their faces and it affects the relationship, and then you just are on your face before God, weeping and saying, Lord, how could I say that, or yell? And then you go to your kid and you say, will you please forgive me? And of course, even maybe the button pusher or the one who really tests those limits looks you in the face and says, you're forgiven, Dad. You're forgiven, Mom. Has that been part of your experience as well?
I think it has. I should probably send this recording to Jeffrey and say, listen to this and then get back to me on that. What do you think?
Yes.
What do you think? What do you think about what
I want to get the afterword from the boys.
Right.
On that note, if you had limitless time and talents, what ministry would you like to participate in or start?
Gosh, if I had limitless time and talents, I'd probably lie around the house all the time. No, I think it's on that same net what we were just talking about. I would want to work with a ministry that recruits, trains, and places male mentors, not with kids, but with younger dads who don't have a sense of what they're doing. We have big brothers, big sisters. We have programs that place men with fatherless boys for mentoring, and that's absolutely fantastic. And there's lots of data behind that. It appears to be one of the few interventions that really does make a difference. It works. But I would like to see now a lot of the boys who grew up without fathers and who've become dads to have somebody who's already done this be able to come and say, here's what I've learned. I'll listen to you. I'll offer what advice I can. I'll offer what suggestions I can, and I'll sit here and listen to you and help you, and be there for you and pray for you as you do this, because I realize you don't even have a pattern. You're doing this without, you're putting together, you've been given a puzzle and there's no picture of what it's supposed to look like. It's just a bunch of colorful pieces on the table in front of you, and you have 18 years to put together a 75,000 piece puzzle. Good luck. At least we could hold up something and help folks.
What was your favorite book? Favorite book as a child?
The first book I ever read was Charlotte's Web. And I remember crying at the end of that book forever. I mean, it was at least an hour. And my mother took me to the library and she said, there are other books in the library just as good as this one. Okay, there aren't, but there are other books in the library almost as good as that one. But I also, I loved to read when I was a kid. Loved reading. That's what I wanted to do all the time. And I read a lot of historical fiction, and I really liked books in World War II. And I liked books that were set in international, with international settings, particularly biographies. I didn't read a whole lot of books as a kid that I didn't like.
Are there 2 books that have impacted you this year?
Since the pandemic began, a friend of mine in Colorado and I have been reading Christian living books, and then we talk about them every week over Zoom. So,
cool.
Yes, he's an English teacher, so he writes down questions, and we have our own little, book group. But it's good because it's just the 2 of us, so we can share a lot more intimately than you can with 10 people around. That I'm not about to say that in front of all these people. But we've been doing that, and the first book we read was Boundaries, which is a classic, but I hadn't read it, neither had he. And then we read one called Dangerous Prayers, and now we're reading Wild at Heart by John Eldredge, which has been transformational. And for me, my friend had already read it, and in fact, about 10 years ago, he tried to get me to read it, and I said, no, I'm never reading that book. I already know what it's about, and I know I don't like it. And and he said, it's nothing like what you just described to me. When I told him I knew what the book was about and why I wouldn't like it, he said, it's nothing like that. And I said, no, I'm sure it's like that, and I'm not going to read it. So after we started this little project where we meet every week, after we did the first book, he said, okay, now we're doing Wild at Heart because I get to pick next. I said, okay, fine, I'll read Wild at Heart. And I've just loved it. I have loved it. I have loved Wild at Heart. It's really been a tremendously helpful book to me. So
I was going to say, you're picking Charlotte's Web next, right?
No.
Or Pride and Prejudice. Okay.
Well, you say that. That's funny. One of his favorite books is Pride and Prejudice with zombies.
Really? With zombies?
With zombies. Have you not read Pride and Prejudice with zombies? No, it's yeah. You can even buy. I was at Jane Austen's birthplace, and it's in the gift shop. You can buy Pride and Prejudice with zombies.
Wow, that's next level. Next level, Holland. So you have a wonderful co-host, Amy, who's a teacher on your podcast, The Afterword. And one question that I like to ask is, what does she bring to this show, and what do you bring? What's unique about each of your contribution?
Well, you know what I want to say, right? I want to say she doesn't bring anything to the show, and I just bring it all. But she might listen. Yeah. She might listen to this, so I better not say.
Mic drop.
When we first started, our idea was, well, I'm a full-time writer, and she's a full-time reading teacher. So she said, we've got writing and we've got reading. So we knew we weren't going to talk about how to write, and we knew we weren't going to talk about how to teach reading because there are already a mazillion podcasts on how to write, and I couldn't teach reading if I were paid to. So I wasn't going to be able to contribute anything to that. That would have had to be her podcast. So we started looking at, well, if there are trends in the world, and what are the stories and the words that shape how we think about those things? So if we take artificial intelligence, what are the stories we tell about that? What are the words we use when we talk about artificial intelligence? How does that shape what people believe to be true about artificial intelligence? And is what we believe to be true actually true? Or is it just the story that we tell ourselves? So Amy's a teacher, and she brings that understanding that what one person is communicating, another person may not be receiving. What one person is learning, another person may not be teaching. There's a gap between teacher and learner. We often don't even know it's there. She's been in the classroom a long time, and one of the things I know she will bring up a lot is teacher talk. There's too much teacher talk. We need to be listening more to what's being said so we understand what people do, what people know, what they don't know, and what they think they know that they don't know. And then we can help them. Otherwise, we're just talking at them. We're not really helping. So I think that perspective her perspective as a teacher shapes the way we construct our interviews, because we want to know what it is we think we know and what we really know. When we did an episode on telling stories using your genealogy, learning and telling your family story, one of our guests said there's a fine line between legend and reality. She said everybody will tell you they're related to somebody famous. They're descended from royalty. And she said, all right, I'm just going to help you with your genealogy right here. You are not descended from royalty.
And what about you? What is something you bring?
Well, I kind of come at it from the other perspective because I'm creating something for people to learn from, right? Creating articles that hopefully people will read and learn new information from. So it's easy to start out and say, oh, I already know about this subject, or I already know how this works, and find out that prevailing wisdom it isn't right. There's not data behind it. When you start to write an article about it, you can discover actually the data says something else, or the data's not there.
So, Holland, I know I listen to your podcast on Apple. Where's the best place people can reach you and to find your book, Adventures in Fatherhood, which I highly recommend. If you want a different perspective from a writer, it's beautiful. I love your book.
Thanks, Meg. The podcast is at theafterwordpodcast.com. And then you can find this on Apple, Stitcher, and all the other podcast watering holes on the internet. But theafterwordpodcast.com is where we are. You can also go to my website, hollandwebb.com, and a lot of our episodes are almost all of our episodes are on my website as well, hollandwebb.com. The book, Adventures in Fatherhood, is a 60-day devotional for dads that I wrote with a friend, Carlton Hughes. His sons are just a little bit older than mine, and so we wrote from the perspective of two guys who just finished this journey, and what would we say to people coming along behind us. Carlton is a professor of communication at Southeastern Kentucky Technical and Community College, and so he's not a specialist in parenting or counseling psychology or anything, and I'm certainly not. But so it's not a how-to book. It's nothing like that. It's just 60 days of our thoughts on what it means to be a father and what we've learned using scriptures and our own experiences and just sharing our stories in little snippets. So you can read it as a 60-day devotional, one a day with a verse of scripture and a prayer at the end, or you can just sit down and read it straight through. We've known people who've done it different ways, but you can find that on Amazon and in most bookstores and secular bookstores and Christian bookstores. It's Adventures in Fatherhood by Carlton Hughes and Holland Webb, 60-day devotional for dads.
And there's so much in there for all parents to take away, especially the humor. It's, just being able to laugh at yourself as a parent and appreciate some of the moments that would make you cry or pull your hair out. You've said so well. Can you give us one story from there?
When Jeffrey was about 8, John Paul was about 7. We had a swing set in the backyard, and John Paul came running into the house. He was a little bit hard to understand, but he said to my mother, "Grandmother, get the scissors and come quick." Well, she didn't know what he was talking about. But she got the scissors and followed him, and he took her outside and through the back gate. And there on the swing set, Jeffrey was standing on tiptoe on the swing. So, the swing was bent under his weight, and he had a string around his neck, and it was pulled so tight that he had slipped a finger between the string and his neck so he could breathe. And so my mother went over with the scissors and, cut him down. And I got home from work that night, and she told me about this. And I said, "Why did you hang yourself from the top of the swing set?" And he said, "I was pretending I was British." And I said, "What?" He said, "I was being hung for high treason against the crown. I had my musket here." He had gotten this musket when we went to the Alamo in San Antonio, this toy musket. He said, "I had my musket and I was being hung, only that I really was hung and I couldn't get down." I remember thinking, okay, we've got to stop watching these BBC, British Broadcasting Company historical shows. We were watching Horatio Hornblower at the time, which I'm sure is where he got the idea. You wonder how anybody survives to adulthood, because I think everybody's tried something like that. The verse that I used from that was the one out of the book of James. I think it's James, I want to say chapter 5, verse 1, but I'm not positive. It says, if anyone needs wisdom, ask of God, who gives liberally without condemnation. Kids do crazy things, right? And kids do all kinds of things you're not expecting, like and much more serious things, right? I mean, kids do all kinds of things that you don't really expect. That they get involved in stuff. They make choices that you didn't see coming. And no matter what, if you are a follower of Jesus, you can go to God and say, "I have no idea what to do. I never had anybody show me what to do. I don't have the foggiest idea how to handle this. but I trust that you do. And I trust that you have wisdom and that you will give me the wisdom that I need right now to do the thing I need to do right now. I may not understand the whole situation, but I can act wisely with the next words that I say. I can act wisely with whatever choice I make here and now. So it's an opportunity. So that's the kind of thing we talk about in the book.
That's great. Yeah, it's funny when you become a parent yourself, all of a sudden the things you didn't realize you should be thankful for, like, wow, I've got all my fingers and toes, and I actually know how to read. You have no idea what a process that is. Just the fact that you grew up and you have your limbs and can read, how much sweat and how much your parents, especially like for me, my mom being a single mom for so many years. Wow, I didn't realize how much I needed to thank my mom for or be grateful. What do you love about each of your sons?
When I was 17, 18, 19, I would certainly not have joined the army or jumped out of an airplane or done anything like that. So I really admire the fact that Jeffrey went off and did that. I wouldn't have had the nerve to do it. I would have been afraid of what other people would think. I would have been afraid I couldn't do it. I would have been afraid I'd killed myself jumping out of a plane. And I'm kind of a klutz, so I probably would have. But he had the courage to do it. And he had, I don't know if it's courage or foolhardiness, but one or the other, to jump out of the plane. But not just that, but to go out and try something that was big and hard and challenging and scary, and to go do it anyway. John Paul has always marched to his own drum beat. And that's something, I said at the beginning of our conversation, Meg, that my mother was a contrarian. I think John Paul, if one can inherit from one's adoptive grandmother, he inherited that streak. He doesn't feel compelled to do things because other people think you should do them, or society thinks it's conventional or whatever. He lives the way he wants to. And there's a lot that's admirable in that.
Sometimes those kids are a little bit harder to parent, but as you see them grow up, they have such a drive and big ideas. And I am loving watching that unfold in our kids as they're soaring into adulthood. What quirk does each of your sons have that you tease them about?
Jeffrey has a voice that's, when he was a little kid, his Sunday school teacher said to me, he sounds like James Earl Jones. And he did. He had this massive voice, and he still has it, but he also kind of modifies it to sound cool. So
he should be a podcaster, but yeah.
He really should. Yeah, he really should be a podcaster. He used to have a YouTube channel that had a massive number of subscribers, and all he did was play video games. People watched him play video games. I don't understand the thrill, but anyway, I think it's that too cool for school voice that he has. John Paul does not like to be teased, so I don't do that anymore. But when he was little and was more amenable to it, I borrowed this from a character in Charles Dickens, but I would say that he had a sister, Jean Pauline, and she was perfect. So whatever was going on, I would say, if your sister, Jean Pauline, were here, she wouldn't have done whatever it is he'd done, or she would have solved this, and we wouldn't have any, all these problems or whatever was going on. Just to tease him. He didn't care for that. He got tired of hearing about Jean Pauline, especially since she didn't even exist. But I got that from one of the characters in David Copperfield. But I thought it was clever, and I did it for a while till he made me quit.
A quirk they tease you about?
Jeffrey sent me this thing the other day. It's one of what do they call those little GIFs or GIFs or whatever, GIF? How do you pronounce that? GIF or GIF?
Hey, it's a millennial boom situation, how you pronounce it. Sorry.
That thing. And one of them said, "Dads, when the kid leaves the bathroom light on all night," and had a picture of a man saying, "I will never recover financially from this." I said, okay, I will own that. But the other one had a picture of a referee with this sharp expression on his face, and it said above it, "Dads when talking to waiters in restaurants." And I said, I do not do that. He said, "Yes, you do." So I don't know. You have to ask the waiters at the restaurants that I patronize whether I do that or not. But
nice. I like that. Hey, the relationship's decent when the kids are sending you memes. We just have to celebrate.
Is that what that is? Is that a meme, not a GIF or GIF or whatever?
Well, I don't know. Is it not for you to sound like total dorkle heads here, but is the GIF? I think it's the one where it's live and active and it's a cartoon, and a meme is a picture with a word over it.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think you're right. Yeah. Okay. Then these were memes.
If you're part of their meme game, you're in, Holland. You're in, man. The kids are like, "Mom, you shouldn't do a Bitmoji. But now it's just so generally accepted that even in my 50s, I've got a Bitmoji, and I try and use the words they teach me, and they're like, Mom, that's not where you use that word. Like, well, then why are you teaching me? I don't know. Holland, what flaw keeps you on your knees in prayer, and what does that struggle look like, and how have you found God help you with it?
Well, there are a lot of flaws that keep me on my knees in prayer.
A lot of flaws.
Something I've talked about recently, and I alluded to this early on when we were talking, my mother would make a big change in her life. Every time she could get rid of her entire life and go just open up a new one every few years. And I kind of adopted that way of doing things, right? I would, every few years, we sold up in 2009. We sold everything pretty much and went to Guatemala for 3 years. We came back, we started another week. And now I'm in a position where I would like to do that again, but I have her and I can't. I've got to learn how to make the life I have good rather than just go pick up another one.
And that can be really difficult, is staying put. And I think that's why there's the whole midlife crisis thing is the thing, because you get to a point where, or one of our favorite shows, As Good as It Gets. If we didn't have the Lord, sometimes you could look at the mundane as, is this it? Is this all I got from life? But the Lord brings joy to that day. So what character or person in the Bible do you most admire or relate to?
Well, I have two favorite characters. They're both in the Old Testament. One is Esther and one is Joseph. And I don't know if I relate to them, but I admire them because you can see their stories are long enough that you can see how their character matures. And I believe it's Million Miles in a Thousand Years, Donald Miller says the point of a story is not the end. The point of the story is how the character changes in the struggle in the middle. And it's easy to jump from a beginning to an end when you only see a short segment of a character's life, this sort of a snapshot. But with both Joseph and Esther, you see this much longer period of time in which they are changed, right? Joseph starts out as this brash guy, telling his father that he's going to bow down to him and wearing his robe and sort of lording it over his brothers. And by the end of the story, he's a very, very different person. But he doesn't just become a very different person sort of because he prayed and became a different person. He becomes a different person because his brothers throw him in a pit and sell him to a caravan of slave traders. And, he's falsely accused. He does something good, but he's accused anyway, and he's punished for it anyway. And you see in the struggle of his life, Ryan Holiday wrote a book called The Obstacle is the Way. And I think that's what you see in his life. And Esther's story is a little bit more abbreviated, but you kind of see that there too, right? At the beginning, she's very passive. Women's ministry leaders like to hold her up as like this great woman who went out and, accomplished, like she's some sort of warrior queen, maybe by the end. But at the beginning, she just does whatever her uncle says. He says, you're beautiful, so go participate in this contest to be the next queen of Persia. So she does it. She does whatever the leader of the harem tells her to do. And finally, she has to take agency on her own. Right? She has to take risks. She has to show courage. She has to gather up and do something independent of what everybody else tells her to do. Yes, she's still getting the information. Yes, she's still getting direction from her uncle, but she's acting, right? The locus of control moves into her lap, and you see her take responsibility. And her uncle says, you need to do this, but he doesn't tell her how. She figures out how. She's the one who has the courage. She's the one who goes in and does what has to be done. And I like the fact that you actually see them change. And you sort of almost see a magic line that eventually they cross where they stop being people that you don't really want to be around. And they start becoming people who can change the world around them.
Wow. What a great answer.
Thank you.
That's really encouraging. What does being a child of God mean to you? And what quality of the Lord are you most grateful for?
Well, we had this whole conversation about fatherhood and the book Adventures in Fatherhood. And then the way you phrase this question is child of God, not what is being a follower of Jesus or being being a Christian, but being a child of God. What does that mean to you? And I think it means, for me, there's somebody who's right there, and you can look at that and say, you can look at him and say, I've got a question. I don't know how to do this. I don't think I can. And you can get advice, you can get help, you can get a kick in the butt, you can get whatever it is that God is going to give you that will help you grow.
I trust you love Holland's story as much as I do, just hearing his vulnerability and his realness, that he's not been a perfect parent, that adoption is not easy. It's hard on everyone, and yet something beautiful came out of it, right? I love his heart for just saying, maybe I should be the one. And I'm just praying for us all as we listen. Maybe there's something that we need to step out in and trust God for. Maybe today is that day that we step out and redeem something for someone else that was lost for us. Patreon is a platform for creatives and their supporters. On Patreon, we like to share some extras with our Letters from Home members. If you Google Patreon and look up Meg Gleesner, you will see 3 sign-up options and bonus material and swag we only offer there. I have added a 10-minute bonus clip of really funny banter between Holland and me. Plus, you will hear the answer to the question that Holland asked every one of his episode guests on his podcast, The Afterword. He gives us the answer to the question, what is a metaphor that helps us understand the great Holland Webb? And I thought I would just surprise him with that. His answer is amazing. Also, you will hear how I keep myself from becoming a hoarder, and I get a little sassy as well as cry. Plot twist, right? And all of the contributions from Patreon only go toward making every episode even better for our listeners.
Links from our guests will be in the show notes. For more everyday extraordinary faith stories, go to our website, lettersfromhomepodcast.com, and click subscribe or follow on whatever platform you're listening to.
2 Corinthians 3:3. And you show that you are a letter from Christ, delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts.
Until next time.